Welcome to DG Networks, a member of Universal One Broadcasting, and this the 78th program in the series of Crossing Over the Bridge, and episode 9 of Whole of Community Change, featuring Annalise Jennings, Director of Dynamic Exchange, David Shearer, Director of Shearlift Management, Henry Sweetland, Partner of Shearlift Management, and Father Patrick McAnally. Annalise Jennings is the Director of Dynamic Exchange, has over 25 years' experience in senior roles in financial services and other sectors, including property and small business. She's an experienced facilitator and has led business transformation in project management in large organizations and has an extensive background in risk management and organizational culture. This experience has been gained through working in India, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. She has spoken on transformation and maximizing human potential in a variety of business and community forums. She's passionate about teams and helping them discover healthy working relationships and celebrating success and empowerment. She balances her time between key corporate events, a part-time career as an alternative health practitioner, and has always combined her working life with parenting and study. David Shearer is the Director of Shearlift Management, and partner Henry Sweetland, also a partner of the Shearlift Management Group, a company born in this era of environmental and social sustainability with a focus on new building techniques that also includes aid to nature, underwriting what may perhaps be the world's first fully funded, recyclable passive energy building technology, using a very unique building system and with planned life cycles of 45 years for its buildings. And Father Patrick McAnally, who leads the Aid to Nature program via Social Working Order, a program or stakeholder restoration, where engineers engage to support programs technically for harvest yields in bamboo downstream, maximizing economic outcomes for stakeholders. McAnally holds a Masters of Counselling from Notre Dame University in Western Australia and commenced his pastoral work in Melbourne. He spent 35 years in missionary work in Indonesia and Timor-Leste, during which time he focused on village community development in the areas of education, health, and income-generating projects. His vision is to raise the quality of life of village-based communities. Annalise Jennings, David Shearer, Henry Sweetland, and Father Patrick McAnally join me today on Crossing Over the Bridge, the 78th program in the series and Whole of Community Change. Welcome to Crossing Over the Bridge at DG Networks, a member of Universal One Broadcasting, dedicated to today the Whole of Community Change with Annalise Jennings, and I shall start with yourself, Annalise. Welcome to the program today.
Thank you, David.
And also David Shearer. David, it's a great pleasure to have you in this panel today.
Indeed, thank you very much, David. Looking forward to the discussion.
As am I. And Henry Sweetland. Henry, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Very much looking forward to it myself, David.
And finally, Patrick McAnally. Patrick, Father Patrick, it's a great honour to have you with us also.
Well, my pleasure, David. Thank you.
Start with yourself, Annalise. You are looking at new projects, new places. You're travelling, and having been so successful in Queensland, specifically with Napranum, of course, that we've covered for so many hours in programs, I'd like to provide an update of where you are, what you are achieving here, and the company that you're in. It's an interesting time for you, I'm sure.
It's a very exciting time here, David, and I feel very privileged, actually, to be in the company of like-minded people. We're here in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, and that's exciting in itself, surrounded by wonderful culture and beautiful people who are really looking after us. The essence of whole of community change is about doing things with people, not to them, and the spiritual message about dynamic exchange is about the giving and receiving of energy, be it within ourselves, to one another, out to the environment, out to society and out to humanity. And I remember when David Shearer first connected with me, and one of the things he said to me was, "Annalise, how would you like to grow your own home?" And that really captured my interest, and I felt very, very intrigued. And I've noticed over the last 6 months in particular that whole of community change is really picking up momentum and is attracting like-minded people from around the world. So I've had many connections from different parts of the world, and also quite broadly right across Australia. I've presented a keynote at the Indigenous Leadership and Governance Forum in Brisbane last week, and the level of engagement around there really heartened me. I felt very privileged. So there's connections there from WA, from northern New South Wales, southern Queensland. So it's expanding. So it's very, very exciting to be here. There's lots of conversation that I'd love to have about the synergies between whole of community change and what SheerLift or Aid to Nature, and the connection between us. So I'll look forward to that conversation as we move further into dialogue.
Annalise, thank you. Just before I move on to David, can I ask you, Annalise, we're looking now at sustainability, the need for, and I would imagine the recognition of different types of energy. In the States, of course, there's many groups that look at free energy. Is that a departure for you in some ways? And if it is, it must be a very exciting one, Annalise, that you're moving from a community like Napranum, and now you're looking at the way that construction is taking place with the sustainability in mind, with ecosystems in mind. That must be an exciting time for you, is it not?
It really is, but I'm not seeing it as a departure from the core essence of what is dynamic exchange and what is whole of community change. It's really an evolution. When we consider that whole of community change is about that giving and receiving of energy between ourselves, out to society, out to humanity, out to community. And so as I'm starting to learn about this amazing company, what I'm understanding is that, you know, this is about partnership with traditional owners, with First Nations people, where environment and social sustainability is really at the forefront of what we do. And whole of community change began that process in part through the transitional joint venturing construction that started at Napranum. But what I'm seeing through this particular company is that the opportunity to go into far more depth and breadth is just so far-reaching, and that's really something that I would be asking David and co here to respond to.
Annalise, thank you very much for that. I think that was an important inquiry to posit to you. I'm going to turn to you, David, and I realize that we don't have Rob Crawford here today, the CEO. Would you like to introduce yourself, your background, and the synergies that you are seeing yourself appear here with Annalise Jennings and others?
Thank you for that, David. Firstly, to reflect upon the origins of SheerLift, and it's a building technique founded some years ago at the behest of my younger brother. And I did very little about it for a number of years until I came to Indonesia and met my dear friend Warren Daubney, who's a renowned architect in Indonesia and has succeeded in such projects as embassies and otherwise. So Warren was very tolerant of my engagement, and we determined that we had a unique opportunity to found a new building technique that was capable of transition for a construction industry itself that is very challenged for cost. So SheerLift is very much about productivity gain. So if I could just leave it at that point, and explain that our technology is now at a stage where it's delivering to market. But during this process that has gone on for nigh on 7 years, I was determined to discover a way in which we could engage with, as I refer, native peoples, because many of my associations are in the United States, but with Aboriginal and Islander peoples in Australia. And it was on Australia Day some 7 years ago that I met with the wonderful Balgo art people from Western Australia in an area that's a desert, well, of a kind, near to the Northern Territory border. And I was inspired by their belief mechanisms and their wonderful art. It was through that engagement that I hit upon an idea of how we could deliver buildings to Aboriginal and Islander peoples in Australia that were non-European, if you will, in nature, and were unsuitable to their culture and lifestyle. We have observed over the years that the buildings have been unsuitable and unsuccessful. The spiritual inclusion that we hit upon was that we had an opportunity to deliver buildings into remote regions of Australia where the cost effectiveness of them was sustainable. But we could not provide an opportunity immediately because we were not wise enough to know, or experienced enough to know, or knowledgeable enough of Aboriginal culture to realise the potential other than art and culture itself. So the idea of spiritual inclusion was to provide buildings that were with clear walls and without decoration, and that as a component of the contract, the Balgo Art Group and their fellow artists from the Aboriginal communities would decorate these buildings over a period of time that was of their own determination, but that the substantial contract would be to their benefit and sustainable and ongoing, building after building. So first of all, we had an opportunity that meant that buildings could be delivered to Aboriginal communities in remote Australia cost effectively, and that there was a dividend to the Aboriginal and Islander peoples by way of art and culture in the decoration of their own buildings. If I could cite a simple example of a standard residence in remote Australia, it may be $750,000 in government terms to install that building in remote Australia. And our idea was to have at least a 10% component of that for art and decoration. So a very, very fair and reasonable sum, but one that would be sustainable and provide employment. That was my genesis, if you will, my beginning, my first attempt to find a relationship with the communities. I stuck with that goal, but of course I had to concentrate on the technology and to perfect it and make it into something that was viable in broader commerce. So approximately 4 years passed, and through relationships with the Australian mining and oil and gas industry that are so present in Aboriginal and Islander people's lands in Australia, I was encouraged to approach another Aboriginal peoples in Western Australia, and we in fact designed a building remarkably on the basis of my architects being Indonesian and having absolutely no knowledge or experience of Australia, forgive me, and of Australian Aboriginal and Islander culture. And yet we produced a remarkable design that I would welcome and share with your audience. The very point of that building was that it was a magnificent example of how we could embrace working with Aboriginal and Islander peoples on the basis of not just decoration, but in fact the design and the manufacture and the installation and the management and ongoing maintenance of that building. And so as time passes by, you work hard to refine and open the opportunity, but it is not as easy as you think it might be. And so brings me to the present, when I 5 months ago hit upon the broadcast of social media in Sweden, and one Annalise Jennings And so I had the great privilege of watching her speech in stone and the casting of stones to the audience and how it was so beautifully explained. And so being a LinkedIn member, I thought, well, that's the best way to find Annalise. So I persisted a bit and found ways of getting a hold of her email address. So we became members of LinkedIn. And perhaps I'll stop at that point and give you a chance to draw a breath.
Let me just stay with you for 1 minute, David, and Henry, I will come to you, sir, in just a moment. And David, this is a brief response, because there's some fascinating assets to this. You're talking about spiritual inclusion, you're talking about the Balbo people, you're talking about those belief systems there. And, my work, and Annalise recognizes this, of course, is being in part a transitional strategist. And in everything that you proposed there and you laid out, you painted this picture, it suggested to me that you are, in effect, whether you appoint yourselves as architects or builders, you are actually transitional strategists in creating new homes, new environments, new communities. Am I accurate with that? That you are not just building something, but you're taking perhaps something in the past to be becoming something completely transitional for the future?
Correct. My particular goal, and I lean for wisdom and advice to Rob Crawford and Pat McAnally in particular in this regard, and my chairman, Dr. Bob Shearer in Adelaide, to receive advice from the point of view of adapting this approach so that we remain relevant to the current market, but are able to drag it into the next dimension. And that's what our product's about. It's an end-to-end value chain for buildings, architecture, communities, their needs, energy, water, Epicurean principles of food production, and so on. And so, yes, to answer your point, clearly we are very much about transition.
And I appreciate that clarity, David. Let me move on to Henry Sweetland. Henry, as a partner in this, what is your position? How do you see this? Can you paint a picture of this world that you're in and also your work?
Sure. To give us, a brief background on how I became involved with David in the first place in the whole Shearlift empire, if you like. Several years ago, I was doing a development in Australia. It was going to be a traditional 10-story concrete monolith, essentially. I was introduced to David through some mutual friends and started dialogue with David in regards to the whole Shearlift technology, the whole ethos, the philosophy behind it, and where it was, what it was about, and where it was heading to. I was very intrigued by the renewable energy side of it, which are technologies that will be unfolded and introduced as we progress, which will be it's pretty much a never-ending cycle that it just continues as technology develops. We increase it include it into our buildings. After several trips up to Indonesia, met with David. He invited me to be his partner in this business. And it's been a fascinating journey in the sense, as I say, not just on the technology side of things, which is I have a passion for. The philosophy, as I was saying, that I've been able to introduce affordable housing to people, to be able to introduce buildings, particularly as we've been talking about here in the Aboriginal or native peoples of the world's communities, where we can bring affordable housing, bring renewable energies, particularly in remote areas, where that can be a huge advantage to a lot of these communities, as I say, particularly in the remote areas. Been linked in with Annalise over the last few months, gotten to know her and her philosophies, and it's just struck such a chord with me in so many different ways of in evolving in relationships with native peoples, with their communities. It's very, unobtrusive from our point of view. It's very much listening to what they want. It's very much about establishing a line of communication with them, and deeper than that, an understanding and a philosophy of understanding what they're about and what we can offer them to, in the community as a whole, to increase their whole their whole lifestyle, their whole ethos. They're bringing in it's a whole self-sustainability for the communities. So they're not reliant on governments. They become more reliant with themselves, and we have what we believe an opportunity to be able to bring this into them with our technologies and our beliefs and our same philosophies of thought.
Henry, thank you. I'm going to return back to you later on the area of remote areas in terms of feeding in renewable energy. Actually, feeding in may not be a good way to define that because it's already there essentially. But let me turn to Father Patrick McAnally. Interesting here because David had talked about the Balbo people inspired by their belief systems and their art. And of course, you have been here for many, many decades. Your thoughts and a picture of your background, Father Patrick.
Thank you, David. My background started off in Belfast in Ireland, and when I was 14, Mum and Dad decided to migrate to Australia, and I grew up in Brisbane, and I joined the priesthood then and studied in Melbourne. I was assigned pastoral work in Melbourne for 3 or 4 years, but I found that the pastoral work wasn't satisfying my soul. I sort of saw my work there in Melbourne as maintaining the church, where there was a yearning in me to not only to maintain but to actually build and found the church. So I was directed to Indonesia. I came up to Indonesia as a young priest, full of energy and idealism, and that was mainly, expressed by going out into the villages and seeing what villagers needed. And when we talk of 30 years ago, 35 years ago, when I did my work, the main needs of a village then were pretty well the same in each village. There was one of people asking for health facilities, education facilities, and income generating projects. It was a time when the government here were wanting, to fulfill those needs in the villages, but they just couldn't do it. They didn't have the resources at that stage, the huge population that we have here in Indonesia. So, as a missioner and with my missionary mates, we were able to step in and make some contribution in those areas. And it was going down the pathway of village development and fulfilling those 3 basic needs in the various villages. We sourced our funds, from governments like Australia through AusAid, who funded a silk training project in East Timor, from the German government, Miserior, from the US Aid Department, from CAFOD in England, Gorta in Ireland. And it was only when probably the governments and the international NGOs were looking to other countries to support, and not so much to Indonesia, that we then, myself and my mates, turned over towards corporates. And we found that there were many corporates who were willing to work on their community social responsibility aspects with us, and that's what brought me into direct contact with both David and with the Shearlift. And it's especially of the this project we're talking now of the bamboo micro plantations. I could see that as a way of building up the local villages here and the communities, of educating the young students in the way in bamboo cultivation, and then in the off products of bamboo, the many potentials that there are in bamboo. So for me, it was a way of furthering my mission in developing peoples, developing communities, creating employment. And I was particularly attracted to Shearlift because it had that spiritual inclusion in its philosophy. So it looks to be a good match, good mix and match. And that's what I'm looking forward to developing as we go down the track.
Let me just stay with you, Father Patrick. Thank you for that. And this prefaces my next point for Annalise, but just let me ask you, And this could be perhaps a bit of a foundational point on my part, even perhaps naive, who knows. But a friend of mine, John Perkins, wrote the book The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He had spent much time in the 70s and 80s developing countries like Ecuador. And of course, he came back after many years and realized that providing electricity, turning lights on, had a very detrimental effect. How is that different today, or what are the proposals here where you don't just deliver an infrastructure without any spiritual input, but you are introducing something that is going to enhance the culture and create the next step for that culture? I think this is a good question for you, Father Patrick.
Yes, for me personally, I would put a very low priority on any project that did not have a spiritual aspect to it. Number one, the Indonesian culture is steeped in spirituality, much more so than Western cultures. So it's absolutely necessary in the carrying out of projects. I would think that to do a project without some, without spiritual inclusion would have that negative effect. It would be sort of tending to put something in that would be heartless and not in keeping with Indonesian culture.
Annelies, that brings me back to you, because purposely setting out that to include spirituality, of course, Napranum, we talk about the Creator. Really important component here, isn't it? But you have developed this so well in community, so that those elements in the historical context are enhanced and not diluted.
Well, the program or the process of co-creation with community is about creating economic development alongside the spiritual well-being of the people. And my personal belief is that one can't happen in isolation of the other. So at a very, very practical level, as we start to create infrastructure in the community that the community have actually engaged in and have identified as their own needs, to be able to, alongside that, and look at empowerment and spiritual development, build the capability of the people is a natural fit. And I spoke to Father Patrick earlier today, and he said some very meaningful things to me that I'd just like to recap on. He spoke about the building of village communities. He spoke about sustainability. He spoke about the integrity of creation. He spoke about spiritual values and the dignity of the human spirit. And that really deeply, deeply struck me, because these are the core values of the whole of community change. And the program, and that, as you know, through so much dialogue with Marianne Coconut, and Marianne knows that we've gathered here today, by the way, it's about that connection to the Creator Spirit. It's about the remembering of who we truly are. It's about being able to ask ourselves those age-old questions of who am I? What do I stand for? What's my connection to my identity? And at a collective level, what are we here to create together? And to me, this just speaks beautifully to the narrative of creating a balance between economic development and spiritual well-being.
You just used the word identity there. Annelies used it so much, and Father Patrick, of course, had talked about the soul. There's an evolution, isn't there, of finding one's identity, whether it's on an individual basis or whether it's in community, because of this transitional undertaking that is taking place that David has talked about too so well. But that is very important, is it not? The identity, to ensure that it's not diluted as well as everything else, but to keep the identity, to share that with other communities, even I would say with government agencies, private industry. Identity is a big part of this whole package, I believe.
I believe it is, and it works at so many different levels. And so identity is very much that very deep dialogue that we have with ourselves about remembering who we truly are. And so when we take away all of the many layers that we hinder ourselves with as we go through the stages of life, to be able to take away those layers and to really come to the true core of this is who I am, and the very deep and meaningful power that gives you to be able to really stand connected to Mother Nature and to be able to deliver that and to calibrate yourself, your mind, your body and your soul, and to be able to absolutely deliver that with true conviction and say, well, this is who I am. And I believe that that has to be the starting point. That's the pebble that we cast in the pond. That's the power of the ripple effect. It has to start with that core identity. And then as we start to remember that and allow those ripples to be whatever it needs to be, then we connect to that identity, to Mother Nature, to society, to humanity. It's all encompassing. That's the realms of the consciousness that we work at it through this process.
Can I just turn to you, Father Patrick, with that, and then I'll return back to you, David and Henry. Father Patrick, this word remembering is used a lot in our many dialogues. Perhaps we could bring into that incarnation. I'm not sure. If we had Steiner here talking about that, it would be interesting, wouldn't it? But is today, after so many years of colonization, lots of history in that, dynamics changing as a global village, is remembering a really important part for Indigenous people today, perhaps more than ever before?
I think so, David. I'll give an example. I had the privilege of working in East Timor, or Timor-Leste, for 3 years. And I went over there just as the Indonesian forces were leaving or departing from East Timor. So I was there for that emergency phase until the East Timorese were able to get up and vote for or become an independent nation. What struck me was their sense of identity. They never lost that, and from the Portuguese colonization of the country, then to the Indonesian annexation, the East Timorese people were solid. I would say that, one of the things that struck me was a man over there saying, Romo, and they call me Romo, that's my term for father. Romo, we've been treated like monkeys for so long. It hasn't made us monkeys, but it has embittered us. It has made us revengeful, because we now have a country and we don't know how to run it. We don't know how to administer it and how to run departments. All through that colonization period, even though we were called monkeys and treated like that, we never lost the sense of our own identity, that we are a strong, spiritual people, living in poverty, but with great hope for the future. And, that future is being realized now. So identity, yes, is something that if it's let go, it's to their detriment. And so I give credit to these Timorese people for holding on to that identity through thick and thin.
Thank you for that, Father Patrick. I was going to take that on one step further, perhaps later. Let me return to you, David Shearer. We're talking about community. We've talked about transitional purpose, let's call it. And interestingly, and I forget who it was that raised this, and I was going to, Annalise, return back to you soon on the prevalence of mining in Australia, in many countries. That is a funder in a way. And I wonder whether that in some ways is also a compromise. You either have government funding, you have private industry funding, you have funding from the mining communities. How do you look at that David, how do you see this operating in terms of funding out these programs where you do get involved in remote areas that probably don't even have access to funding, let alone writing a grant proposal? How do you look at that? Where do you think the best road is to take in the future for funding operations like this?
Thank you, David. The first point I would make is that in all of my approaches to deliver quality buildings that were of design and scope determined by native peoples, my vision was about a product that I had developed with a number of brilliant people and dedicated and caring people that would dramatically shift the economic model for delivery of those buildings. And so you have two options. You have a board of directors with a large number of shareholders. They demand all of those profits, generally speaking. That's their job. I had no such obligation. And so the delivery of those buildings empowered me to create an opportunity where the inclusion of native peoples and Aboriginal and Islander peoples in Australia's needs of their determination could be achieved, and sustainably and ongoing. But of course, we needed to understand the nature of the funding sources that Aboriginal and Islander peoples have access to, and of course, much of that relates to the mining and oil and gas sector, who really are Fortune 500 corporations. Now, those corporations today are extraordinarily sensitive to public profile, and of course they are dedicated to improving their performance. But of course, their job in business is mining and producing minerals and oil and gas. They're not necessarily expert in the field of delivering an improved program for Aboriginal and Islander peoples. They negotiate royalties, of course, but their duty is not necessarily towards producing a more perfect outcome for Aboriginal and Islander peoples. Now, fair enough, but in fact, common sense would dictate over time, if the possibility exists, you should pursue it, because your corporation will be the better for it. And I do see that in evidence in Australia, in a limited sense. I don't see it from government at all. Rare exceptions, as Annalise has proven. Here we are today, and looking toward a program of relating to a model that is sustainable for Aboriginal and Islander peoples. And we determined that not just the financial power of our product would be used, but also we would adopt policies that enabled us to bring forward programs that could be managed more eloquently and more perfectly by Aboriginal and Islander peoples, native peoples around the world, and that is our Aid to Nature program. Essentially, it's a simple formula. For all of our buildings and every 200 square metres of those buildings, 2,000 square feet if you're in North America, we apply 1 hectare of microplantation development, predominantly based in bamboo, because we believe in the enormous potential of bamboo. So with that program, we've targeted towards native peoples, Aboriginal and Islander peoples, and Annalise has become very much a part of that.
You very kindly sent me an overview as a form of research for the program today. And I was very interested in a couple of statements that you had made. You had indicated that Father Patrick leads the Aid to Nature program, the social working order, and I will come to Father Patrick on that. And you also talked about competition. I am trying to find it here. You talk about avoiding dilemmas of conflict, absolutely. And you also talk to avoiding, as being very important, competitive distractions. Now, this is really important, I think, here, because this is why I raise government, private funding, charities, etc. because competitive distractions is very complex. It needs to be handled very carefully. Would you like to just follow up on that a bit and talk to how those competitive distractions can be completely eradicated in a world where you are acting as a transitional force?
My core principle, my first principle, if you will, in determining that we maintain our programs sustainably without the need to deal with the competitive force is to respect the market. And so as we look at the wider impact of our ShearLift technology, for example, we look at major cities, we look at towns, we look at tourism, we look at hotels, we look at all manner of buildings, and we respect the nature of their value, their core value. We could, if we were some form of rampant market chaser, come in and undercut the market and destroy the fundamentals of the market. That's unnecessary, and it doesn't help society at all. And it certainly would annoy your bank manager. What we say is that the core values of our community empower our position, because even though there are commercial niche advantages in our product and its viability of delivery, meaning we install and commission a building and it's into cash flow before the foundations are up in a competitive building. That's an important dimension. But most important to all of my briefings to colleagues when they've come and joined is to say, look, let's feature up our buildings. Let's make them more habitable. Let's make them greener than green. Let's make them higher ceilings, because we're not putting extra rows of bricks. We're just increasing the scope of a manufactured item, and low cost at that. So all of this avoidance of competitive force is basically bound up in respect for the market, and to use the tools of your commercial advantage, your profitability, to increase the features of your buildings, to increase the philosophy of the experience of being in those buildings and in those communities, and at the same time to yield an additional dividend about which you can then go on with further research and development, newer products, newer definitions. That's our philosophy.
Rather esoteric this, David, before I do leave you. Is there also merit here? Because we're moving into a new era, and we realize that agrarian culture, all sorts of different cultures from the past are going to come back to the foreground again. But would you also say that this could be a way to moving communities such as those that you're involved in to a position off the grid?
Absolutely. Because we are empowered through our commercial niche advantage to adopt renewable energy generation and also regenerative water and also waste to energy conversion and other forms of renewable energy, we are empowered to provide basic needs, autonomy, if you will, for remote communities or non-remote communities. We perceived of that trend some 5 years ago, and we've continued to focus in its delivery. And whenever our client partners are keen to approach any source of renewable energy or regenerative water, we engage them, because we do have the technology solutions at our disposal.
Henry Sweetland, Henry, any thoughts of the discussion thus far, particularly David's point on autonomy, having been through the inquiry from myself of off the grid. Any thoughts from yourself?
Yeah, it's very much a part of our future, I guess, is the to being off grid and more networking, whether that be in perhaps communities that may be near each other, or could be in suburbs in towns or cities that are already there, where we can put in particularly new developments. We put in our renewable energies where you can share them with the neighbouring block or the neighbouring suburb, and you share and network with each other, where it does become totally off the grid. As David alluded to, or as he said, the water regeneration, or the various ways of gathering energy, whether it be solar, wind, waste energy, These are all areas of the technology, as I was saying earlier, that are going to develop as we progress, and it's very much networking. That could be anywhere, in any communities, anywhere, and I truly believe that's the way of the future. It just has to go that way.
In your whole of community change components, number one in those components, Annalise, one of the line items is create collaboration between the community service providers and government to ensure the community has ownership of and responsibility for the appropriate provision of services and funding. This is an interesting dialogue that we're taking here, interesting direction, because this is actually what you work on in terms of finding a balance between agencies that are outside of the immediate remit of somewhere like Napranum, because in a way you are trying to find an autonomy. It is a balance here. Your thoughts?
David, it's a perfect fit, and I'm kind of jumping out of my seat because I'm just so excited about all of this. David said something really that struck me, and he said that the core values of the community actually empower our product. And as you know, I spend an enormous amount of time in engaging the people and for the people themselves to identify what the core values of their community are. And typically what continue to be at the top of the list are community ownership, working together, belonging, and fairness, equity, and engagement. And so to actually be in the company of a like-minded, collaborative service provider that is far more than just about construction, but about renewable energy, recycled. I mean, the opportunities are absolutely endless. The whole of community change is about creating a values-driven community, and community values are absolutely at the forefront. And when we look at infrastructure and services that have been imposed on community and the level of paternalism, control, and intervention associated with that, and where whole of community change is about creating economic development alongside the spiritual well-being of the people, so that the people themselves actually create their own community blueprint. And that's all about autonomy. But that next evolution of whole of community change is to look at those services and those infrastructure that they can actually own and maintain for themselves. And so there's great possibilities in that around empowerment. So it's just a perfect fit.
I must move to you, Father Patrick, here, because Annalise, David, amazing synchronicity here, Annalise, because I had notated here when David talked about empowering the product, and I immediately wrote down empowering the culture and the traditions. And this is a wonderful question for you, Father Patrick, because I think indigenous cultures see themselves as not divided from the nature, not divided from the soil. They have a much more creator-based approach. They're almost in a different dimension. Certainly, Indian tribes in North America, with whom I've spent a lot of time. But when you're talking about empowering products and you're talking about bamboo that David has mentioned, you surely are, Father Patrick, talking about at the same time, out of default, empowering the culture behind that and the tradition, because it's doing exactly what they need, and that is revisiting and giving back to the soil, back to the nature. Is that a valid point?
Extremely so. You know, what drives me is trying to get across a deepening experience of the integrity of creation, and that we should become stewards of creation. You know, as a steward, a person says how to protect and to enhance, and that's the aim that I have for the work that I do in the villages and with the communities. And it's easier to do that here in Indonesia with the village communities, because they already have a foundation, of the sanctity, of the environment. They have a foundational approach to the dignity of human life. So in empowering their culture, like it's already embedded in their culture, and it's a matter of, I think, passing that on to the younger generation, because the younger generation are experiencing disillusionment with the lack of employment, and the young school children are being distracted away by their iPods and their notebooks. And so I think it's important to bring them back to that sense of identity that we talked about before, where they will gladly undertake a shared responsibility to protect and to look after Mother Earth, that their forefathers or their parents are so well committed to. Yeah, I've seen this happen in the Silk Training Center that I set up in 2001, and it was in East Timor again. It was the challenge to offer employment for the young people of the area. It introduced a new product, and that was silk to East Timor. We started off with land preparation, with the cultivation of mulberry plants, with the silkworm eggs, with the feeding of the silkworms, the mulberry leaves, and then the processing of the cocoons, the spinning of the cocoons into fabric, and then weaving the fabric into garments like the ties or the scarves. I worked on that project for 3 years. And then when I was transferred, before I was transferred, I had already started to prepare for the handover. And when that happened, it was a young group of about 12 or 15 young men and women who carried that project forward, and they haven't looked back. They had a sense of their own self-worth, sense of their own dignity. They were not going to let this project fail. They felt they owned it, and they gave it their best. So in connecting with the culture and with the traditions, it's important, as Annalise has so well described, giving that sense of ownership, that sense of power to empowerment to make decisions and to see the way forward.
I'm going to return back to you in a short moment, Father Patrick, because Annalise, I have to talk about your two components based around, in some ways, healing programs, Women of Worth, Men of Worth, and we have dedicated some programs to this, hugely important. Father Patrick there is just talking about offering this word worth. Would you like to just follow up on that?
There's a lot about what Father Patrick said that really struck me, but what struck me the most was his comment about creating this sense of self-worth. And so with the Men and Women of Worth program, while the women are with me, we're talking about creating a sisterhood, we're talking about women's business, we're talking about women elders and young women coming together around the campfire and singing and talking about what's deeply meaningful to them. And while that is happening, the men are gathered somewhere else, and they're talking about men's business and what it means to be a man in the community and how they can best serve their community. Now, the collective conversation that we are having is about community business. And that's a very powerful conversation, because they come away with absolute clarity about their own sense of self-worth and how they can continue to drop those pebbles in the pond of self-determination, of empowerment, of love, of compassion, of care, of future generations. And so all of that contributes to the growing of this community blueprint. So, this is about connection to the Creator Spirit, and I'm not surprised that we are seeing such a a significant synergy here in our conversation because we all come from the same source. And so this to me is a soul-to-soul conversation, and I feel that Marianne is very present here today, and I wish that she could be physically present to actually express how she's feeling about this right now. But something that I would like to say is a quote that Marianne gave in one of the ABC videos. And she says, in the evolution of an acronym, what's the point of having all of the new infrastructure? What's the point of having all of these new buildings if the people haven't actually changed on the inside? And what she was saying is that she has evidenced, these people change. People in the community have shifted from the inside. And so they are an absolute demonstration of reconnecting to their sense of self-worth and the spirit of human dignity.
So I'm going to take this to David Shearer. Thank you, Annalise. And I was going to return back to Father Patrick, which I will do. But David Shearer, can I ask you here? I'm going to refer to your notes again that you kindly sent me, because Father Patrick, or perhaps yourself, talked about a vengeful, indigenous people who were avengeful, and I wrote down the word resentment, and now we're talking about dignity of life. And in your notes you talked about Father Patrick's leading Aid to Nature program, and you talked about social working order, and then you said a program or stakeholder restoration and not commercial exploitation. And it seems to me that when you utilize this stakeholder restoration, that is what's wrapped up in restoring the dignity of life. And it seems to me that what you're doing here as a transitional purpose is taking that dignity back in so many ways, including building properties, building houses, utilizing bamboo. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, indeed. If I may, the approach of our design for the community, be that a large master plan community or a small community or a single building that we've designed for a massive mining operation, the approach is that the building shall provide the optimum habitation experience for its inhabitants, of course, whilst maintaining a community-driven commercial viability. But even more than that, we found that because of the fact that we were able to provide water regeneration and energy generation from within the basic economic model, we did not need additional investment. We were then empowered to determine, well, what if, in fact, we generate more energy than we need? It happens already, I believe, with the solar energy and wind energy in Europe. But what if we were to generate more energy? What would we do with it? Or water, for that matter. And so we approached the matter quite simply by saying consumption at source. And so we opened the forum to the principles of Epicurus, as I call Epicureanism, and essentially we consume what we produce principle, and it's possible to reach 50 to 60% sustainability in food culture, provided you have the resources of water and energy. And people, of course, both to produce and consume. But the more one focuses in that source, the better the outcome from the point of view of energy conservation, logistics distribution, and so on. And I come from that background. That's the genesis of my design scope, is I'm supply chain transportation background. And so by viewing this, it becomes a never-ending concept, because each time you approach the blooming thing, you're reducing the economic model for a household budget, We're not paying $3 for tomato today. I grew them myself. Not only that, I took a few eggs down the street, and so on we go. But it's a sense of pride that you do these things. And I believe it's a source of empowerment for a community to embolden itself and grow. And I believe that's in fact how our societies reached the point that they did. We got a bit lost in the last 50 years.
You just mentioned excess energy, and this is not a controversial or conspiratorial remark, but in the United States, now solar is being used. What is occurring is that the major power companies, particularly in states like Arizona and New Mexico where sun is plentiful, is it is being fed into the national grid, but there is a charge back to the consumer who is operating these solar panels and in effect creating excess energy, rather than giving them the kudos and allowing them to utilize those chargebacks for themselves to create a greater local culture and community. Is this something that you're aware of, and do you think that that can be changed so that any excess energy remains with the community to build again its culture?
Well, in the first sense, regulation is a dictate that we all must cope with. But I believe that our approach to apply these solutions of ShearLift and Aid to Nature and its sister enterprise Aid for Nature through Native peoples and Aboriginal and Islander communities, because they're all remote, they're independent of the melees of regulation to be empowered to consume their own energy. And I believe that rather than spend a great deal of time in Washington attempting to re-regulate the process and take on major corporations, the answer lies in example. Just as Annalise provides example to our own Australian community, and God willing we get some attention for that sooner than later, and I believe that's happening. So it is in the approach to sustainable autonomous communities through Native peoples and Aboriginal and Islander peoples, First Nation peoples, that we can achieve this outcome more succinctly, because there isn't an alternative, and the cost of delivering power to those places through the grid is an absolute fortune.
Let me just turn to you, Henry Sweetland. Henry, listen to this dialogue. Any thoughts from yourself on the autonomy, on the way that this system is being structured, what you're alluding to and what you're actually creating and being successful with?
It's a big question. It's a huge vision that we all have in front of us, and that's, I think, the key to it, is the vision to it all. It's more than just renewable energies, which is obviously a major part too of what we're doing, particularly when we come to the Native peoples or the First Nations or whatever. In a lot of areas there, what we can bring is into these things is like an employment opportunity, particularly like with a lot of these new energy sources. They can be trained to look at those, to be able to maintain those systems, and it's bringing employment and so forth. I'm a firm believer in most people want freedom in their lives, and to me, the more options you have, the more freedom you have to be able to live your life the way you choose to live it. And I think by these opportunities with the technologies we have, the building systems we have, the Aid to Nature with the bamboo, it's offering new opportunities for any and everybody that wants to be involved in it. And along with those opportunities comes your options, hence your freedoms to be able to live your life how you want to do it. And I think that's a really critical part and very important part to the whole thing that we're about. And as I said, it's the big vision of what people really want in life. And to me, I see it everywhere I see it in the world. Everybody ultimately wants freedom to be able to live their life the way they choose to.
Henry, thank you very much. And we do come to the end of the program, and like to start with yourself, Father Patrick McAnally. It's been a wonderful dialogue today. It always shoots by, and I'm sure that we shall do many more moving into the future. But Father Patrick, your final thoughts having been through this discussion today?
once again, I'm even more energized. I want to translate into practical terms, what my colleagues here, Annalise, David, and Henry, have stated. I'm the chap who goes out and sits down on the dirt floor and discusses with, the men and the women and the children of a village to get the ideas across of dialogue about any project, to get that idea of ownership across. And then, according to the Javanese culture here of gotong royong, they call it, of working together, to be able to achieve those projects. So, once again, I'm energized, and I hope that I can energize my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Father Patrick. And Henry Sweetland, to your final thoughts for today.
Well, exactly as Father Pat just said, this is it becomes more and more exciting as we delve further into this, as we're creating the relationships with Annalise and the understanding of whereabouts with the native peoples. It's invigorating. It's quite empowering actually within yourself. And I'm truly looking forward to visiting many of these communities with Annalise in the coming weeks, months, to get a true and deep feeling for it. I mean, I have my own beliefs on how I feel about it now, but to actually be immersed in it and be there and just absorb and soak up that whole ethos, the whole culture, the whole spirituality of what we're about, I think it's just so incredibly empowering, not just for the native peoples or whoever we're dealing with, but truly within your own spirituality, within yourself. And I think it's such a powerful medium to have. It just opens the world up to everybody.
Finding out who we really are again. David Shearer, your final thoughts, sir, if you may, on the dialogue, and perhaps your final thoughts on where you will take this journey now with Annalise, Henry, and Father Patrick.
Thank you, David. Firstly, to thank you for hearing us today. It's been a privilege, and particularly to have the opportunity to reach out to an audience around the world. And to say simply that I'm available at any time in support of Annalise to join any program you may wish. But if I could sum up by saying that our position now is to continue with great belief in what we are now able to deliver, and to do it in the appropriate forum, and with the guidance and leadership of Annalise and Father Patrick in particular, to achieve what it is we seek to achieve, and to know that we will continue to improve our performance.
I shall finish today with Annalise Jennings. Annalise, an exciting dialogue, I believe, and exciting times as ever moving forward. Your final thoughts for our dialogue today?
David, I feel completely privileged and humbled by the dialogue here. David mentioned something earlier about the balance between optimum habitation experience and driving commercial viability. And for me, that really represents the balance between economic development and the spiritual well-being of the people. For me, a whole world of renewable energy has just opened up in front of me. And so I'm very much looking forward to being the learner and absorbing as much as I can, and I'm ridiculously excited about that. Several communities have connected with me just in the past week, and it seems to be happening now on a daily basis that they are seeking engagement. And so I'm just so excited and can't wait to get out there and connect with communities on the topic of autonomy, ownership and self-determination, and collectively let's drive this forward. Thank you.
Well deserved for all. I'm sure that it is time. I'll start with yourself, Father Patrick McAnally. It has been a great honour today, and look forward to more conversations with you. Absolutely, no doubt. Thank you so very much.
It'd be my pleasure, David, and thank you very much.
And to Henry Sweetland. Henry, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, David.
And David Shearer.
All the best, David, and thank you once again. Wonderful opportunity.
Finally, Annalise Jennings, as usual, it's a great honour to work with you, Annalise, doing such incredible work.
Thank you, David, and I pay tribute to the the Indigenous people that are connecting on this topic. And so in gratitude, thank you very much for today.
You are all welcome, and that completes our programme today, Crossing Over the Bridge, dedicated to the Whole of Community Change project with Annalise Jennings. You can gain information on this and any other programme in the series at the official website, davidgibbons.org, or for international facilitated panels such as these, crossingoverthebridge.com. Meanwhile, wherever you are in this world, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.